Good. So last week, what we were actually focusing on is how can we use some principles of mechanics to understand the distribution of forces or tension on the belts, which is wrapped around the pulley. And we actually saw that we have got two pulleys. Basically, one is the driver pulley, or which is basically driving the other side. So all the input which is coming from the motor or from engine or from any other source is being supplied, the torque is being supplied to the input pulley, which is the driving pulley or the driver pulley. And we also saw that because of the way the belts are wrapped up, they actually have a difference in the tension on the two sides. So you have one side has got a higher tension, the other side has got a less amount of tension. So because of the differential in tension, you actually see the torque being transmitted. And this is the belting equation we actually focused on, that how can we relate the forces on the belts with the coefficient of friction, which is small f here, and P is the angle of contact, which is the angle of wrap of the belt around the pulley. And we actually know how to obtain that using geometrical relationship. So I will give you a couple of seconds here to look at this slide and let me know if anything that is that you are not able to understand, or if there are any variables that you would like me to explain again, or if there are any specific terms that you are not understanding. So please let me know and I will explain again. So please have a look at this slide and let me know if there's something that you are not actually understanding.
I just want to make sure when you go to do the formulas, is F1 always going to be the tight side and then F2 is always going to be the loose side?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And the way to determine that in this relationship, this is you have to the way that you can remember that the tight side tension, or basically the ratio has to be greater than 1, because this term on the right hand side is greater than 1, exponential
Okay.
and coefficient of friction times the angle of wrap. So if this is greater than 1, then basically the numerator has to be greater than of the two. Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. And any questions from anybody about what the F1 and F2 stands for and what F3 stands for? What is M here? Let me actually ask you very quickly, what is the formula for centrifugal force? If you know the mass, you know the radius, and you know the angular velocity. If you remember from your dynamics class or from kinematics class, what is the formula for centrifugal force? How can you calculate a centrifugal force for a mass which is rotating in a radius, in a circle of radius r with angular velocity omega?
Is it velocity squared divided by radius?
Velocity squared divided by radius. Fine, okay. And can you convert that in terms of omega? Because the velocity that you are talking about is linear velocity. So it is v squared divided by r. So if you convert the v into omega, what will that formula will look like? Or the expression will look like?
Would it be r omega squared?
Right, come again, please.
Is it r omega squared?
Is r omega squared. So that is acceleration, and when you multiply that with mass, it will be mr omega square. So here, what you are seeing here is mr square omega square. Do you see? Can anybody attempt or guess why is there a mistake in this expression, or is there something else in here?
Is it because the two radiuses of the two drive bearings?
No. So we are still working on one side of the pulley. So we are just working on this differential element, and from there we actually get the expression. But we are just working on one side of the pulley. We are not. I mean that the extra r here is not basically taking into account the driving side pulley. So any other guess or attempt, or if you guys understand, if you can explain it to us. By the way, everybody agrees that the centrifugal force is basically given by the expression mr omega square. Is everybody okay with that part?
Yes.
Yeah? Yeah. Where is this extra r coming from? Why is it extra r here? Okay, so probably I have mentioned it last week, but not emphasized it quite a lot, that this mass that you are looking at is this mass per unit length of the belt. So basically this is not actual mass of the belt, it is mass per unit length. So when you basically look at the expression of this dF, dF is the centrifugal force, so this will be mass times R will be your actual mass times R. So this extra R is not a incorrect expression. It is basically multiplied by this mass m, which is a mass per unit length, to give the entire expression a same unit as Newton, which will be mr omega square. Does it make sense? Yeah?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, please let me know if you are not following it or if it's not making sense. So I will try to explain again. But if it makes sense, then we can move forward. And the reason I wanted to make it clear that it may happen that if you actually work and you are actually solving numerical methods or working through the numericals, you will see that why there is an extra r coming, because centrifugal force is mr omega squared with r squared. So that's the reason I thought to basically mention this specific expression. Anyways, so we actually saw on the last slide or the last lecture that this the tensions on the two sides of this pulley have different components. So if it is a tighter side tension, F1 is a tighter side tension, and F2 is, let's say, the loose side tension, and that's the nomenclature we are using to represent a tight side tension by F subscript 1, and F subscript 2 represents the loose side tension. And both the tensions on the two sides comprised of different components. So first component is the initial tension in the belt, then the centrifugal force that we just saw and we discussed, and the last component is about the tension that is, or the force that is coming because of the transmission of the torque. So these are the three components that you are seeing here on the tighter side. The loose side will have the same initial tension, the centrifugal force, but negative of the differential force that is required to transmit the torque. So these are the different components of the forces on the tighter side and the loose side. And this is the part where I actually stopped our discussion in the last week, which is to show how the initial tension actually plays a role in deciding how much amount of torque can be transmitted. So this chart is very important, and this figure, that basically shows that how the tensions on the belt is varying as a function of the initial tension. So if you see in the x-axis, it is initial tension in the belt, and on the y-axis, it is the tension on the two sides of the pulley, so F1 and F2. So if you see, there are two lines. One line represents the F1, which is the tighter side tension. The second line here represents F2, the loose side tension. And these lines are basically drawn by plotting F1 as a function of initial tension. So when I start with the leftmost part where my initial tension is almost or actually equals to 0, at that point I see that both the lines originate from one point, and that point basically means that both the forces on the tighter side and the loose side are same and equal. Does it make sense to you guys? So if you can look at the cursor which I am pointing on the screen, this is the point at which the loose side tension and the tighter side tension are just the same magnitude. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And it basically means that you do not have any ability, or the belt does not have any ability to transmit any amount of torque. Even if there is a friction, it does not have any ability to transmit the torque, any torque basically from the driving side to the driven side. But as you keep on tightening the belt, so it is basically means that the belt is just simply wrapped around the pulley and it is loosened. So that means there is a slippage happening. So the pulley is continuously moving. So if you look at this pulley, the pulley is continuously rotating, and because the belts are just loose, so they cannot just transmit the torque from the pulley, from this pulley to the next pulley. So they are basically loose. That means there is no initial tension. That means the belts are basically having a slippage of over the pulley. And that is the reason that there is no torque being transmitted. But if I slowly start on tightening this belt, what is going to happen? What I will see that the tightening force or the initial tightening force keeps on increasing. And because of that, there is a gap being, or there is a difference being generated between the loose side tension, loose side and the tighter side. And this gap keeps on increasing. And what this gap is reflecting, the amount of gap represents how much amount of torque can be transmitted. So more the gap is, more is the amount of torque. So it basically says the more you tighten the belt, the more will be the torque, more will be the capacity for the system to transmit the torque. Of course, there is a specific limit. You cannot keep on increasing this limit, because after a certain point, what is going to happen, the belt will just snap up, because belt has a material that has got certain elastic property, it has got certain strength. So after a certain amount of stretching, after it actually carries a certain amount of load, which is this represented by F1 allowable. A stands for here allowable from the manufacturer's value. So after the gap has increased to this much, where the belt tension, the tensor tension has become equal to F1 subscript A, after this point, the belt will just snap up. So belt will not carry anything, the belt will break. So this initial tension actually plays the most important role in deciding what is the capacity of the belt drive to transmit a torque from the driven side to the driving side pulley. So that is the most important figure to remember from the belt drive for designing a belt drive. So if you understand this specific figure, you understand the mechanics behind that. A physical reasoning is that the more the tension in the belt is, the more better will be the efficiency to transmit the torque from one end to the other. The belts are loose, it will lose the tendency to transmit the torque. Make sense, guys?
Yes.
Any questions from anybody so far? Again, if there are anything in this slide which doesn't make any sense to you, or you are not able to follow, please ask me and I will try to explain it. Any term, any variable, anything that you are not following in this. Is everybody good so far?
Yeah, we're good.
Yeah.
Great. So the next couple of slides will be just like I will be breezing through, because we already covered and talked about it. It is basically showing the expression for calculating F1 subscript A, the maximum allowable load or tension in the belt from the manufacturer's catalog value. So there are some correction factors, there are some rating values, some bits of the belt mentioned in there. So these are the expressions you can use to calculate the largest allowable tension in the belt. These are the graphs for some correction factors. CV, basically velocity correction factor. These correction factors are needed because for a certain material, for example, for leather belts, as if the belt speed is high, then the material will have the tendency to wear out. So to take into account of the wearing tendency of the belt material, these correction factors are used, which says that if the velocity exceeds a certain amount, then what will be the correction factor that you should take into consideration. Of course, there are certain materials like European polyamide belts where the speed of the belt does not affect the wearing tendency of the material. So in that case, you don't need any correction factors. For that case, CV is just equals to 1. And this is a pulley correction factor. So depending on whether the pulley, you have a small belt wrapped around a smaller pulley or a bigger pulley, there are specific correction factors that again you need to take into account. So you can refer to this chart and you can pick a specific value relevant to the requirement and use it in the expression for calculating F1 subselected, the allowable tension, maximum tension in the belt. Okay, these are some other factors. I think you can go through that and just quickly go through the steps here for analyzing flat belt drives. First, you need to find out what is the angle of wrap around the belt, and that angle of wrap depends on the smaller diameter, the bigger diameter, center distance. Based on that, you can find the angle of wrap around the smaller pulley or the driven pulley. From there, you can calculate centrifugal force. You can calculate the torque, find the maximum belt tension, find the loose side tension, calculate the friction coefficient that is required, and see whether that is less than the actual value from the manufacturer's catalog value. If it is less, then that the belt you have chosen is going to work in your specific application. But if it is not, then you have to change the belt material for the desired transmission, torque transmission or the load transmission. These are some of the steps we actually saw in the last lecture, and based on some of the homework problems, you will get the chance to practice implement these steps and practice some of the numerical problems. So that will also help you to go through each step and see how to use them and how to implement them for selecting a specific length of belt and specific material for the belt for a given application. So you will actually get to know when we actually do the homework problem. I mean, these are the steps we actually discussed last week. So before I proceed further, any questions and concerns from anybody so far? Okay, if not, so this is the some of the schemes for retightening up, or basically to make sure that you can adjust the initial tension if the belts start loosening up. So what happens that after a certain period of time, when the belt is transmitting the torque from the driven side and to the driving side pulley, then after a certain amount of time, because of the wear in the material of the belt, what happens is the belt starts loosening up. So when the belt starts loosening up, it loses the initial tension. And as I just discussed a while ago, that if the initial tension decreases, so will be the torque transmitting capacity. So that means if I would like to transmit 100 Newton meters torque with continuously, then after a certain period of time, because the belt has loosened, it will not be able to transmit 100 Newton meters because the belt has loosened and it is slipping. And because of that, what we have to do is that we have to provide some techniques or some means to increase that tension, initial tension. So these are some of the schemes that you can use or implement for increasing the tension or for readjusting the tension in the belt. So here you basically see the first one is a weighted idler pulley. If you see here, the pulley here is basically just nothing, it's not doing anything, but it is just an idler pulley which is trying to, if there are any slack in the belt, it will, because of the weight of the pulley itself, the belt will maintain that initial tension throughout the period of service. So basically that is one way that you can ensure that the tension in the belt will always be there when it is in operation. Another way out is that you have a pivoted motor mount. So basically the motor mount is basically pivoted at one end. And then what happens that because of the weight that is hanging, weight of the motor that is hanging on this side, the belt will always be under some sort of a tension. So the weight of the motor will actually tries to readjust. I mean, as the material will worn out and it has a tendency to loosen, the motor mount will deflect in the vertical direction by a delta amount, by a small amount, and it will automatically self-adjust for any loosening in the belt tension. Make sense, guys, so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Any question from anybody so far? Okay, if not, then the last part is about having a larger center distances, and this is basically the self weight will of the belt itself will cause a dip here. That the dip basically is the gap, is the distance, a vertical distance between the horizontal straight line connecting these 2 points and the actual surface of the belt. So basically here the weight of the weight per foot, the weight per unit length of the belt will define how much dip would be. So you can basically again, I mean, here what you're actually seeing here as well, that if the belt has a tendency to lose, then the weight of the system will keep on will provide the mechanism for providing autonomous or automatic adjustment of the initial tension. So if the belt has a tendency to loosen or basically has to worn out, then because of the additional weight of this surface of this segment of the belt, you will find that the tension is getting, initial tension in the belt is getting readjusted. Does it make sense to you so far?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so on all of the 3 schemes, the weight either from the idler pulley or from the pivoted motor mount or from the weight of the belt itself, you will see that the tension is being maintained. The initial tension is being maintained throughout the service of the belt drive, and that is important because without the initial tension, without the proper amount of initial tension, the belt drive will not be able to transmit the desired torque, the design torque from the driven side to the driving side. So that is the most important part about the belt drive. Okay, so last part that I wanted to focus on the belt drive is how the forces are appearing in the different segment of the belt drive. So on the left hand side, what you are actually seeing is a flat belt which is wrapped around the driven side, I mean driving side pulley and the driven side pulley, and these are certain points in this along the length of the belt. So you have point B, A, F, E, C, and D, and what these points basically correspond to will be the amount of tension that will be there at each point is depicted at the bottom. So in the bottom part, you will actually see how the tension in the belt at different points will vary along the length of the belt. So at point A, the tension is basically F1, which is a tight side tension. Assuming that the tight side tension is the top, so point A will have that force, or the force in the belt is basically representing the tight side tension. Now, as the belt moves from point, if I move my point, I mean, if I actually move from point A to point B, but I will see that the tension in the belt remains the same, which is F1. But now if I move from B to C, I will see that my tension has decreased from F1 to F2, which is my loose side tension. So at point C, I have the loose side tension. Point D will have loose side tension, point E will have loose side tension. And then again, when I actually move from point E to point F, I will again go from point F2, I mean the tension on the loose side to tension on the tighter side. Is everybody able to follow this specific distribution of forces along the length of the belt?
Is there a reason there's a sharper turn when you go from the tight to the loose? So like at B, why is it 90 degrees instead of like at C where it's more of a parabola shape?
Come again, sorry, what is the question?
When you're following, so like at A and then B, right at that corner, it's a sharp turn. And then at the
Yeah.
bottom, it's more of like a gradual change.
So, so what you're saying that while you have a sharp change, sharp corner here.
Yeah.
Yep. Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, so it basically says that you are, so you have to basically see that you are basically going from the loose side. So you are increasing slowly, and you are basically allowed to only reach up to the maximum value, and that it will remain there. And thereafter, I mean, we are thinking from going from the loose side to the tighter side. So if you're going from the loose side, you're continuously increasing and increasing till it reaches the point B where it is losing the contact, and thereafter there is no way that it will keep on continuously increasing. That is why you have this continuous curve here. So you basically, the forces are increasing and then it remains stationary basically.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have to think from because the belt is going from the loose side and moving from the loose side to the tension, or basically the higher tension, or loose side to the tighter side. So that way you will basically able to understand that how and why these forces are increasing or behaving that way. Make sense?
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So the forces are basically building up based on the initial tension, the centrifugal force, and the differential force element. So these are forces are building up, and after that time, the belt just lose the contact, and then there is no way that it can have any further. So let me know if you guys are following this specific discussion about the distribution of forces along the belt, along the length of the belt as it moves from the driving side to the driven side. Is everybody okay so far?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, if you have to use any material failure theories, I hope you remember what material failure theories are. If you're not, then let me actually just have a quickly recap. Some of the failure theories we actually covered in 471 is von Mises criteria and Tresca criteria for failure under static loading, and then for fatigue loading we actually discussed modified Goodman theory. So those are the failure theories we actually discussed heavily in 471. So if you have to pick one failure theory based on your previous understanding of the subject in 471, which failure theory are you going to use while analyzing the belt drive, or while analyzing a failure in the belt material? Whether you are going to use Tresca criteria or a von Mises criteria or modified Goodman theory, which specific theory would you prefer to use and why? Let me ask that. Any guesses? That should be fine as well. At least we can have some discussion from that point onwards. Are you able to get the question though? I mean,
No, can you repeat the question?
okay. So let me try to explain the situation here again. So you actually look at this point B, and you will see that at that point, the belt has got a specific amount of tension, which is given by F1, right? And based on the cross section of the belt, you can determine the stresses in the belt as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So now if I look at point A, I see that it has got the same amount of force or tension, which is F1. But if I look at point D, which is this, the amount of force in here is smaller, which is equal to F2. And if I calculate the stresses at that point, which is F2 divided by the cross section of the belt, I will get the stresses, and that stresses will be smaller in magnitude. So what I can do is I can calculate stresses at every different points in this belt segment. Now, if I calculate the stresses, the next question is, can I use the failure criteria that we have learned in the previous class, and can we see which failure criteria we think that will be applicable in this situation? So that's the question. And the failure theories that I was basically referring to, Tresca criteria, von Mises criteria, and modified Goodman theory. So let me know if my question is not yet clear to you guys. Okay, I will try to go and switch to a document camera at this point. So what I am basically referring to here, and probably it may make a bit more sense. So based on, if this is a driven driving pulley and it's rotating clockwise, which one will be the tighter side, guys? Which will be F1 and which will be F2 on the top or bottom? Which will be F1 will be top or bottom? F1 is tight side tension.
The bottom will be tighter?
Yeah, the bottom will be tighter and F2 will be. This is driven pulley. So what my question was, or the reason I was trying to put some more focus in this specific concept. So if I look at this point A, point B, and of course, but I'm point C here, point B. So these will not be the same label as in the slide here. But let's say these are some of the points along the length of the belt material. So I know that at each segment, I know what my forces are, so I can calculate the stresses. So let's say if I calculate the stress at point B, it will be F2 divided by the cross-section area of the belt. So let's say the area is A, which is equals to width of the belt multiplied by thickness. So this is the width of the belt, and this is the thickness. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah?
Yes.
So, yeah, any questions from anybody? Please go ahead. So sigma E, which is the stress at point E, is going to be the force, the tension in the belt at that point divided by the cross section. Cross section of the belt remains the same as it is going from this point to this point. The cross section is not changing, so it is width multiplied by the thickness. So assuming that I know the stresses at every single point in here, now if I have to pick one of the failure theories, the failure theories that I have are Tresca criteria, if you remember. These are the three theories I'm actually giving you as a choice: von Mises criteria and modified Goodman line. So my question is, which of these three theories you would prefer in this specific application?
Professor, would we
Yes.
use the modified Goodman line because of the fatigue failure?
Yes, of course. So yeah, I mean, that I think it should be very obvious to all of you that when I'm talking about different points, it is not a different material. It is the same material that is traveling from point A to point B. After a certain amount of time, it is going to point C. This material point will move along this driven pulley to point D, then point E to point F, and again going to point A. So what that material point, if I actually am sitting at this point, and basically I am at this location, and at this location, and at this location, and I'm seeing different stresses. I'm seeing a stress which is given by this amount, and this is less than this, and the stresses keep on changing as I move from one point to the next as the system is rotating. So what I'm seeing here is basically a stress cycle. So if you actually remember from our discussion of the fatigue, you are actually seeing that the material point is having the stresses corresponding to F1 and F2. So it is sigma EB and sigma E. The stress is vary from sigma E to sigma B. And it is basically some sort of a cyclic stress variation that is happening. And we know that whenever there is a cyclic stress variation that happens in a material, we have to look at the fatigue failure theory, which is we will pick modified Goodman line. Does it make sense to everybody so far?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And the reason being the material is subjected to stresses which are not constant but changing from maximum to minimum, So that is why we have to focus, or we have to basically select appropriate failure theory corresponding to the fatigue design of fatigue failure. So we're focusing our attention mostly on modified Goodman line. If we have to implement that failure theory, or we are basically considering the failure of the belt cross section. So that is the reason I wanted you to focus or basically spend some more time on this specific slide. And the another reason being here is that for flat belts, generally the steps that I have discussed and are shown in the slide does not take into account any of these failure theories, because for flat belts, which are flexible belt element drives, for flat belts, we are not, we basically use the steps, design steps that we discussed in the last lecture and also shown in this slide for belt material selection. In that belt material selection, you will not basically see the use of modified Goodman line failure theory. Basically use very simple maximum allowable tension, or basically some sort of a Tresca criteria, some form of a Tresca criteria, or maximum tension in the material. Because what we actually see that how to calculate the F1A, the maximum allowable load in the material, maximum allowable tension in the belt material, and that will be the driving maximum allowable tension in the belt. And that was our driving condition for deciding the width of the belt, or the thickness of the belt, or the material of the belt. So we do not go explicitly into deciding this or working with this individual failure theory. But if we go for flat metal belts or V belt drives, so flat belts, basically here we are either we are using leather belts or polyamide or urethane. If you're using a belt material, either it is either leather or some form of polyamide or urethane, then we only focus, use the design calculations given by or driven by this specific requirement, which is the maximum allowable tension in the belt. But if you're looking at flat metal belt drives or V belt drives, then we actually have the similar design steps, but it takes into account the fatigue of the material. Similar design steps in addition to taking fatigue failure of the material, fatigue failure into account. So whatever we were discussing about that the stresses keeps on changing from maximum to minimum, and then we have to use modified Goodman line. So those are the concepts we will be basically using when we are going to design a metal belt drives, a flat metal or sheet metal belt drives, or basically V belt drives. So that is the important step that you would not find in the steps we have discussed for flat belts using leather material or polyamide or urethane. So that is one thing I wanted to bring to your attention, because when you actually look at the design steps for these drives, then you probably will feel that there is one step which is missing, which has not taken, or the fatigue failure, or which is basically taking the fatigue failure into account in these systems, but not in this system. Let me know if it makes sense to you guys so far. Is everybody good so far? Or if there are any questions, please let me know. And if you're not following any of this path, just please let me know. I'll try to explain.
We're good so far.
Okay, as assuming that you are all following it so far, then the last part about this slide is that when we are working with this system, like metal belts and V-belt drives, and we are using the fatigue failure into account. So when we do fatigue failure, we are basically working in terms of stresses. And we are talking in terms of stresses, then what happens that there is an additional stress that comes in the material, and that stress is because of the bending of the material around the pulley. So if you imagine that you have a metallic sheet or a V-belt drive that is being wrapped around a pulley, then what happens that let's say this pulley has got a diameter D and the belt material has a certain thickness T, then because of the bending of this belt material, assuming that if the belt material is made of a metal, which is aluminum or maybe some other metal, then it is getting wrapped around the pulley, and because of this getting wrapped around, it is bent. So if you remember from the simple bending theory that you basically have the bending of the beam because of a specific amount of load, and because of this load, there are additional bending stresses in the material, isn't it? And the same situation is happening here, and the amount of bending stress is given by this expression, which is Young's modulus divided by 1 minus Poisson's ratio square times thickness divided by capital D. D is basically the diameter of the pulley. So this is the additional bending stress, or the component of the stress that comes in the material apart from the ones that you calculate using the tension F1 and F2, the belt tensions. So these are the belt tensions divided by the cross section will be the stress in the material. And in addition to that, if you are working with metallic sheet or V-belt drive, you have this additional component of the bending stress that comes that needs to be taken into account. So that is the reason that if I actually switch back to the PowerPoint here, that if you look at this slide now, in the V-belts, you actually have an additional component of the bending stresses that appears at point B when the belt is touching the pulley. So when it is touching the pulley, there is additional component of the bending stresses, and the bending stresses will decrease basically when it goes from point B to C, and it further decreases because it's a loose side tension, and then the same thing happens on the other end, for the driven side. So you see this sharp rise, and this sharp rise is basically the additional bending stresses that was absent in this flat belt. So this is the extra component of the stresses that we need to take into account when we are designing V-belt drives. Does it make sense, guys, so far?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, from anybody? Okay, if not, then let's take a couple of minutes break. I will switch our discussion on the bearing design, bearing calculation. So I will be just joining in a couple of minutes, 2 minutes or so, and then we will start our discussion on bearing design. Can you guys see the slide for lecture number 5, that is bearing selection?
Yes, we
On
can.
the screen? Okay, so today we are going to change, we are going to look at another component, which is bearings and bearing selection. Okay. So these slides are also posted in the Beachboard. So in case you would like to refer to these slides, you can always look at them. And we will be focusing our attention in today's lecture on rolling contact bearing. And before we actually go and understand the details about the rolling contact bearings, just recap our tolerances. So we have seen this slide many number of times now, and now you actually know how to calculate the minimum and the maximum size for the shaft and the hole. And basically, the point here is that for bearings, we generally would need an interference fit between the shaft and the bearing, the inner race of the bearing. So to do that, you probably need to know that what should be the specification or tolerance specification you need to provide to the shaft, and what should be the tolerance specification you need to provide to the inner dimension of the bearing. So these specific concepts would help you to understand or to provide or specify what type of tolerances you need for a shaft and bearing assembly. And this is another chart which basically tells you that for a given specification, what type of fits you get. If you have a hole specification H11, C11, you have a clearance fit. And if you are going from H6 to K6, H7, K6, you have some sort of a transition fit, and then you have interference fits. So these are again another way of representing the different fits and tolerances you will get for the specifications that are provided to you. Okay, so starting with the concept of bearing. So here we are starting with the rolling bearings, or which is also called anti-friction bearing, or simply rolling bearing. So what you have here in the right-hand side is the detailed schematic of the different components. The major components are the outer shell, which is called the outer ring, the inner shell, which is called the inner ring, and then you have the balls and the rollers, the rolling elements. And these rolling elements are separated from each other using a separator, which are also called as retainers. And these rollers and the balls here are basically sitting in a groove on the inner race, and you have a matching groove on the outer race as well. So you basically have the different components, which are outer ring, inner ring, the rolling elements, the balls in this case, and the retainer. So these are some of the key elements, and for different bearings, you will see that our rolling elements can change from simple balls to cylindrical pins to rollers to taper rollers, and that will give the bearing a different nomenclature, whether it will be cylindrical bearing or taper roller bearing. So that will depend on what type of rolling elements we are going to use. So before we proceed further, I just wanted to share just this YouTube video, which is just a minute long, and it describes, or it basically shows you how these balls bearings are basically assembled together. So if you get a chance, can I ask you guys to just click on this link on your screen, and you can basically see how the balls are basically inserted, and the bearings are, the inner race and outer race are assembled together. So please take a couple of minutes and just let me know once you have seen this specific, you have finished watching this video. So do you guys get the chance to have a look at this video?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that you actually understand that how they are assembled together. I mean, that's very simple step, but nevertheless, it gives you a good insight about the balls being inserted and the inner and outer races are getting assembled together by separation.
Is it typical for, because with this one, it seems to have a plastic separator. If it has a metal separator, is it typically the same type of assembly?
Yeah, a typical same type of assembly everywhere, and depending on the applications, you have different materials. So if you want a lightweight design, sometimes the separators are not used at all. So it is basically discarded. So depending on your application, you will have some pieces of elements still there or not, and depending on that, your material selection will be also focused on that. For example, if the bearing is being used for high temperature applications, then you cannot use plastic for sure. You will require high temperature materials that can withstand those operating temperatures. So the material selection basically is based on the type of application where the bearings are going to be used. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I hope you actually get the chance to look at this slide or this YouTube link. And I just wanted to just pause here for a second or for a couple of minutes only to make sure that everybody gets a chance to actually see that how these components are assembled together. Because if you just try to visualize that how the balls are inserted into the outer and inner ray, so the difficulty arises when you have in your mind that the outer and inner rings are in place and you have to insert somehow the balls in there. So if you look at the video, the assembly steps is basically the ring is either the inner and outer ring. Basically the outer ring is first placed in there, and then the balls are placed, and then thereafter the inner ring is assembled and and then the separator is assembled along, and to make sure that the assembly is properly done. And then you have the final component is the C, which is basically to prevent the dust or ingress and egress of the dust in the assembly. So you have the inner race, the outer race, the rolling elements, the balls in this case, the separator or the retainer. The purpose of separator is to make sure that the different rolling elements, the balls in this case, are not colliding with each other, because if they are touching with each other, then there will be contact forces and stresses, and the material, the ball elements or rolling elements will wear out faster. But if you have a separator, then the only contacts are happening are from the top and the bottom, the inner race and the outer race. So the wear will be less, and it will the life of the bearing will be significantly higher if you use a separator or the retainer in this case. So that is the purpose of the retainer. So having said that, so as I was mentioning, depending on the type of the rolling element, whether you have a ball or a cylindrical roller or a tapered roller, you will have a different type of bearing. So you have a ball bearing, cylindrical roller bearings, tapered roller bearings, barrel bearings, needle bearings. So depending on what type of elements, rolling elements you are using, you will basically have the type of bearings. And each one has specific purpose, design purpose. For example, when you're talking about ball bearings, the ball bearings are able to withstand radial loads and axial loads. So the balls are basically able to transmit the radial load. So for example, if the shaft is spinning and there is centrifugal force is being transmitted, or there are some radial loads that are acting, the balls are basically, or the rolling elements as a balls are transmitting the load from the inner race to the outer race using in the radial direction. So that is the radial load being transmitted. At the same time, if there are some axial loads coming in the system, the ball can also transmit the axial load to the assembly or to the housing of the bearing housing. But they have certain limitation. The ball bearings can withstand high radial loads but less amount of axial loads. So in case you know that in your assembly and the system all the loads are coming on radial, then you can go with cylindrical roller bearings because you have more surface area in contact, and that will give you more capacity or more load carrying capacity. The radial load carrying capacity will be very high for cylindrical roller bearings as compared to ball bearings. Now, if you would like to transmit axial load as well, then you cannot transmit axial load using cylindrical roller bearings. So in that case, you need tapered roller bearings. So in this case, you will have the provision to transmit both the radial load and the axial load. Then you have this barrel roller bearings, also called as spherical roller bearings. So it has the specific curvature which is trying to self-align itself. So if there are some alignment issues, then this curvature helps for the self-alignment of the bearing. And needle roller bearings is basically to the most important advantage here is the space. So if you look at the other bearings, you have the higher load carrying capacity for these bearings, as well as the space, the outer diameter of the bearing is smaller. So that means it takes less space for the assembly. So these are some of the specific purposes or functions of different types of bearings here. Okay, so when I was basically talking about the radial loads, as I was saying that you will have the loads are transmitted in the radial direction, and axial load is basically loads are transmitted in the axial direction. So this specification of the radial and axial load will make more sense if you look at this assembly of this shaft, transmission shaft. So this is the shaft here. It has got step geometry. So you have a bearing in here, a cylindrical roller bearing on this side, and you have two ball bearings on the other side. So basically these are the points or the components which are used to carry this or hold this transmission shaft. So when the transmission shaft is rotating or spinning, or basically it is held in this housing, in this assembly, then the load in the shaft is being supported by this bearing location. So we have got a roller bearing and we have got a ball bearing. Now these are the 2 points of contact, and there are 2 different types of bearings. So if I ask you which of the 2 sides do you think will help to carry the axial load? Axial load means if there are some forces in the shaft that tries to push the shaft on the left hand side, on the right hand side, in the axial direction. So for example, suppose you are taking this assembly, for example, and this shaft is carrying a blade or a propeller on this end. So consider that it has got a blade at this end, and the blade is doing some work, and or the propeller is doing some work. Because of doing some work, the forces being transmitted are going to be both in the axial direction as well as in the radial direction. So the loads that are coming in the radial direction are basically called as radial loads and are supported by bearing at this location and this location. If the loads are coming in the axial direction, then only one set of bearings out of these 2 will be able to carry that. So which of these 2 sets do you think will be able to carry the axial load?
The angular contact.
The angular
Okay.
contact ball bearing. Yeah, because the cylindrical roller bearings cannot withstand the axial loads. So there is no provision for the axial loads to be transmitted from the inner race to the cylindrical rollers to the outer race. However, if you look at the balls here, the ball has got a certain point of contact in the axial direction for both the inner and outer race, and because of that, it transmits the axial load from the inner race to the ball to the outer race, and from the outer race to the housing assembly. Does it make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So having said that, I mean, these are some other different types of bearings you can find from McMaster-Carr, and they have different design purposes. At the end of this slide, you will also see some links from SKF bearing manufacturer, and they are pretty informative. So you can basically look at some of the working of the different designs and different principles of the bearings, basically. So having said that, now I will switch to document camera again, and we will be discussing about different terminologies we need to understand before we can start the process of bearing selection for a given application. So let me actually start sharing a document camera. Okay, before starting a document camera, here is just one term, which is bearing life. And bearing life is basically called, or is basically defined as the life in revolutions, such that a group of bearings start showing some failure criteria. So life in revolutions before a group of bearings start showing a specific fatigue, evidence of fatigue failure. So that is basically called as bearing life. So we'll be discussing more about the bearing life in a second. So let me share the document camera. first. Okay, so when we are talking about bearing selection, we need to understand 2 or 3 concepts here. The first concept we have to understand is L10 life. What is L10 life? L10 or catalog is also called as C10 or L10 life, catalog load rating. Okay, C10 is the load, and just give me a second. Catalog L10. So sorry for that. This is C10 and L10 is the life in revolution. Such that 90% of the group of bearings can operate without showing any evidence of fatigue failure. So this is load ratings in kilonewtons, and this is in revolutions. Generally, the standard L10 life that manufacturer catalog uses 10 raised to 6 million revolutions. General standard, and for Timken bearings, the standard life is 90 million revolutions. For Timken bearings. So Timken is another bearing manufacturer. So for them, the L10 life is generally quoted as 90 million revolutions. But in standard practices, the L10 life is considered as 1 million revolutions. And it is defined as the life in revolutions of the 90% of the group of bearings can operate without showing any evidence of fatigue failure. And catalog load rating is the load in radial load in kilonewtons, such that the bearings, 90% of the bearings can have this specific L10 life. So what it basically means here. So let me actually try to explain. So when we talk about L10 life basically means that, let's say I have 100 bearings to test, or I'm basically a bearing manufacturer. I produce set of bearings and I'm just using 100 bearings. So why I'm basically looking at 100 and not only one? Because the life of the bearing is dependent on fatigue failure, and the fatigue failure is stochastic in nature, statistical in nature. It does not have like a determined a fixed number. So because of that, we generally don't talk about the failure of one bearing or failure of any fatigue failure of one bearing. We talk about a group of bearings and say that how much amount of those bearings can withstand a specific load at a specific number of revolutions. Does it make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we talk about bearings, testing or bearing testing or any specification, we always remember we are talking in terms of the group of bearings. Group or set of bearings, not individual bearings. Not individual bearings. So we are basically always talking in terms of a group of bearings or set of bearings. So now let's say, for example, there are 100 bearings as a manufacturer I fabricate or I actually have got from my shop floor. or I used in my, as a designer, I use them in my assemblies. So out of these 100 bearings, I have to see how many of these bearings can withstand a service life, basically the number of revolutions, such that only 10% will fail, such that the 90 bearings will be able to sustain a specific life. So that is what we basically call as L10 life. L10 life means if out of this 100 bearings, 90 bearings can withstand 1 million revolutions at a particular load, which is called a C10 load, that is what we call as L10 life. L10 life is 10 raised to 1 million revolutions, and out of these 100 bearings, if 90 bearings can withstand 1 million revolutions at a particular load, that is called C10. So to explain it further, let's say 90 bearings achieve 10 raised to 6 revolutions for, let's say, 100 kilonewtons. These are some of the numbers I'm just making up at this point just for the sake of our discussion. So what I'm saying here, that out of this 100 bearings, I found that 90 bearings out of this 100 can withstand 100 kilonewton load at 1 million revolutions. Then in that case, this will be my C10 load, catalog load for this specific set of bearings. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. And what has been observed, that there is a relationship between load and life of a bearing rated at a specific reliability. I will explain what reliability means here, but what basically this relationship is, and that is very important here. Is equals to constant. So what this relationship says, that if I would like to find a specific life for a given load, then this is the relationship I can use for a given reliability. So let me actually also show this data on the figure that may be useful in discussing this specific concept. So what happens that if I plot a log of the radial load on the y-axis and logarithmic of the life number of revolutions on the x-axis, and I plot this, then what I actually see, that I actually get the data points in almost a straight line, and that line equation is given by, the slope of this line is given by this specific constant 1 over a. So what is this saying, that at a given specific reliability, for a specific reliability, log of the constant, it is another constant. So if I have a log S and log L, so it just equals the slope. Slope is this 1 over A. And this A is a constant which is equals to 3 for ball bearings and equals to 10 over 3 for cylindrical roller bearing. Cylindrical roller bearing. So what it says, that a bearing manufacturer catalog will quote C10 load and L10 life always. So if I look at the bearing manufacturer catalog, the catalog will have, let's say, bearing options, bearing 1, option 1, and we will actually look at this. At this point, I do not have this chart catalog with me. In the slide, you can look at it. But let's say you have option 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you will basically get a column for C10 load in kilonewton, and you will get a corresponding L10 life, and this is basically 1 million revolutions for all of them. So this is just one column I am looking at in the manufacturer's catalog. There are many options in there. Let me see if there are somebody asking any question. Is that 10/3? Yes, it's 10/3. 10/3 for cylindrical roller bearings. So just I'm taking one specific column, a set of two or three specific set of columns in for the bearing manufacturer's catalog. What it's saying, the manufacturer's catalog has got different bearing options, and for each bearing option, I got a C10 load, and C10 load is corresponding to a corresponding L10 life, which is 1 million revolutions. So this is basically the catalog I actually got. Now, as a designer, I want to select a bearing for, let's say 90 million revolutions. My desired life is 90 million revolutions, and desired load capacity should be radial. Desired should be pick a number here. Let's say 100 kilonewtons. So what basically it means that if I have, this is my design condition, design scenario. So we will actually go into more in depth about this situation, but let's say this is my design requirement. My design requirement is that my reliability is 90%. We will discuss more about that in a second. So design requirements are that my reliability is 90%. My life desired is 90 million revolutions. For example, I am picking a bearing or selecting a bearing for a transmission of a car, and I would like that this specific bearing should last without any failure. It should last 90 million revolutions, and the amount of load that it should carry should be 100 kilonewtons. So these are my design requirements. These design requirements will be different for different designers. For a different designer who is working on, let's say, a lathe machine or a milling machine or some other machine, then for that specific designer, the requirements will be different. He or she will have different desired life in million revolutions and desired radial load. So every designer will have different design requirements. Now, when I actually have to pick a bearing, I will only get these specific numbers to select with, C10 load and L10 life. So how can I use these requirements and match with the bearing manufacturer's catalog value? Do you see what I'm trying to explain here, guys?
Yes.
Yep.
So let me just further proceed in this using this expression, and that will help you to connect the dots. Let me know if you are following what I'm trying to write down here. And let me know if anybody is not following what I have written here. So what I actually begin with, just let me explain the steps, what I have done here. I said that for a given reliability, and as I said, I will define what I mean by reliability. So at this point, assume that for a given specific reliability of, say, let's say 0.90% or 0.9 as my reliability, I have a relationship between the load, the radial load, and the life in revolution, number of revolutions. So then that is given by this relationship, F times L raised to the power 1 over A, the exponent is 1 over A, is equals to constant. So in the log plot, if I plot a log of the radial load and log of the life in revolutions, I will get a straight line. The slope of the straight line is given by 1 over A. And this constant is empirically found out to be, or experimentally it has been found out to be 3 for ball bearings and 10 over 3 for cylindrical roller bearings. Everybody is with me so far up to this point?
Yes.
Yep,
Yeah.
still following.
Up to this point. Then what I did, I said that when I have to pick a bearing from, or I have to pick a specific bearing for my given application, then what I will have as a designer, I will have my requirements. My requirements is that I want my bearing to last 90 million revolves. It can be 90 million, it can be 100 million, it can be 120 million revolutions. No matter what is the number here, but this number will keep on changing depending on what application you are picking your bearings for. So for example, for one specific bearing, I have got these numbers. A desired life for my bearing should be this much, and the radial load for that life should be this much. So that is my requirement. Everybody is with me so far?
Yes.
Yeah, that is my requirement. Now I have to pick a bearing for this requirement. So what I have to do when I have to pick a bearing, I have to find the C10 load, because the bearing manufacturer, when I go and pick a bearing, I always have to go to bearing manufacturer's catalog. So this is a bearing manufacturer's catalog. So I have to go to the catalog and I have to pick a bearing based on my requirements. My requirements are these. I have to translate these requirements into C10 value. C10 value is what? It is the load in kilonewtons, or maybe other if it is in pound force. So it is a load, radial load, that will cause 90% of the bearings to have L10 life of 1 million revolutions. Does it make sense? So manufacturer catalog will only give you these options. For this option number 1, I have got C10 life. For option number 2, I have got different C10 life of my load. C3, I have different C10 load, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to translate this requirement into what is the C10 load I need for my condition, for my case. So I will use this equation which says C10 times L10, because C10 is corresponding to L10 life, raised to the power 1 over A should be equal to F desired. That is my F desired. This is my desired load, times L desired, which is my desired life, raised to the power 1 over A. And then I did what? I took this L10 on the denominator side, and I know L10 standard is that L10 is 1 million revolutions as standard. The thumb of the rule for many manufacturers, the L10 life is 1 million revolutions. If you are using Timken bearing, then the L10 life is 90 million revolutions. So for example, we are using standard bearings, then L10 is 10 to the power 6 revolution, which is here. I substitute L10 as 10 to the power 6, and depending on whether it is ball bearing or cylindrical roller bearing, you can take A, you know F desired, you know L desired, you know constant, and solving this, you can find your C10 value. Yeah, everybody with me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once you got this C10 value, you go to the manufacturer's catalog and select the specific option. For example, if this option works best, then use this option for the bearing for your specific design, for your specific application. Does that make sense? Making sense to you? Let me know if you guys are not following it or you are having difficulty in understanding what we are doing. Is everybody following it so far?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I will stop our discussion at this point of time because I have some other concepts as well to show and to discuss. So we'll basically take it in the next lecture. But before I wrap our discussion today, I just would like to show you how the manufacturer's catalog values actually look like. So if you go to the slide here, and the manufacturer's catalog basically looks like this. So here you see that this is one page of manufacturer's catalog, and here you will see that you actually get an options for different bearings. It has got the bore. Bore basically means the internal diameter, the outer diameter, the weight, radius. These are all geometrical characteristics. DS and DH are the shoulder diameters for the shaft and the housing. These are recommended diameters. And this is the value that I was basically referring to. So for different options, bearing options, you will get a different C10 load in kilonewton. This is for deep groove bearings, and for angular contact bearings, we will have different C10 load. You also see a column for C0. We will actually go through that concept in the next lecture, what C0 means. But at this point, what we are actually interested in is seeing that every bearing, every row will have a different C10, and this continuously increasing. So if you get a C10 load, calculated C10 load as 7 kilonewton, then you know that you cannot use option number 1 and 2. Bore dia 10 and 12 millimeters will not work. In that case, we have to work with 15 millimeters and up and beyond that. If your C10 load, calculated C10 load comes out to be 7 kilonewton. So that is why, that is how you have to pick a bearing from this catalog. And the catalog only will list you C10 loads in a column format, or basically for different options. So what as a designer we have to do is that we have to translate the requirements from the specific application to what that corresponding C10 load should be, so that I can go to the catalog value and pick a specific bearing for my choice, for my application. Does it make sense to you guys so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are other criteria as well, and I have not gone through those criteria. We'll go through that in the next lecture. And other criteria are basically to relate the reliability with the life, and then the reliability with the life and the load. So if as a designer I need a desired reliability, desired load, desired life for my bearing, how can I combine all these parameters together to get a C10 value? And that will be basically the value I will be referencing while picking up specific bearing from the manufacturer category. So before I wrap up this session, very quickly, if I actually ask you, how do you define reliability? What do you mean by reliability? Can anybody take a shot on that? What does reliability basically mean? For example, in the context of bearing, if I say my bearing has got 90% reliability, what does it mean? Or what can it basically mean? We have not explained it here. I have not gone through that discussion. But what can it possibly mean? It has got 90% reliability.
Would it be that 9 out of 10 or 90% of the bearings
Yeah.
produced actually live up to the standards that they say it will?
Perfect. Yes, exactly. So basically 9 out of 10 is basically the 9 out of 10 bearings are living up to the standard that have been specified. Now what the standards are, we have not defined yet. But what we are saying that if a set of bearings has got 90% reliability, that means 9 out of 10 or 90 out of 100 or 900 out of 1000, depending on what is the number of figures you're quoting at, you basically would like those number of bearings should be able to live up to the expectation, live up to the standard. What those standards are, we have not defined. We will define that in the next lecture. But they should be able to live up to the standards. Now, if as a designer, if you are manufacturing thousands of bearings or millions of bearings, do you think 90% reliability is a good number?
I think it depends.
Yeah, it depends. It depends on the total number of bearings you're talking about. If you're talking about 9 out of 10, yeah, of course, why not? Only one bearing is failing, so I can take a chance on there. But if I'm talking about 1000 bearings, or manufacturing 1000 bearings and purchasing 1000 bearings from, as a designer, I'm purchasing 1000 bearings from a bearing manufacturer, and out of those 1000 bearings, 100 bearings are going to fail. Am I going to use those bearings basically in my product?
No.
See, so that basically depends on the context. So which context we're talking about? How many numbers of bearings? If you're talking about mass manufacturing, like if you are working in an automotive company and you are purchasing a bearing for the specific application in your automobile, you will definitely would not like the reliability to be 99. It should be close to 99% or more than that, because that's how you will build the trust for the product that is going to work in the field. And if you are basically working in a very niche application, like in a very categorized special purpose application where you are working on a very limited set of amount, like 2 or 3 bearings or maybe 4 bearings, maybe 10 bearings, then yeah, you can basically work with 90% concept. we don't need to have 99% reliability in that, because it will be or basically not, it will be futile exercise to have 99% reliability for 10 bearings on. Does it make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we will continue our discussion on this reliability, because that is very interesting topic actually, and we will continue our discussion on this reliability specifically on the context of bearing design and bearing selection, and we will see how we can combine the concept of reliability, the desired radial load, and desired life in revolutions, and we combine together all these parameters together and combine together to find what their C10 should be, C10 value should be, so that we can come back to this chart and pick bearing for our design application. So we will do that in the next lecture. And having said that, let me know if you have any questions and concerns, guys. And if not, then we will wrap up our discussion today, and I will see you guys next week.